Whether the game's 2D or 3D or whatever, you have to kind of drill back to why they love that thing. I think keeping one foot in the past is important in going, okay, cool, we've got this new engine, but how do we make it do the thing that people love and, that kind of reminds them of their sort of earlier titles and reminds them of why they fell in love with the Stronghold series in the first place. So that's fine, yeah? So I've been working at Firefly and I checked this the other day, 7 years now, and my very first project that I took on was Stronghold Kingdoms. I think towards the end of Stronghold 3, they knew that they wanted to move away from working with publishers, and they wanted to sort of strike out on their own, and I had a little bit of interaction with the publisher at the time, but I think it was more of a long-term goal of like, okay, cool, working with publishers isn't really working for the company anymore. So let's bring someone in so that when he or she is sufficiently up to speed, they'll be ready to kind of like break out on their own. And that was definitely the plan with Kingdoms. Kingdoms and Firefly are pretty much inseparable at this point. So it holds a very sort of special place in my heart in that regard. The game that I most, for lack of a better phrase, kind of vibe with and connect with is the core Stronghold series. Just because I was a huge fan of RTS growing up, playing Generals with friends, playing all the original Command & Conquers, Age of Empires, of course, all those titles. When I was a kid growing up, I probably played those just as much as anything else on PC. Like, I played sort of a lot of stuff on console, but when it came to PC, I probably played RTS more than anything else. So for me, that kind of real-time strategy is what I connect with best. But Kingdoms has just kind of changed the lives of everyone at the company in such a way that, it's always going to have a kind of special place in your heart, whether it was your kind of game before you worked on it or not. As a person, I would say that I'm probably more considered now than I was before. Like when I first joined games, I was like, quite rightly, I was just like, hit the ground running, just do as much stuff as you possibly can, as fast as you possibly can. Now I understand the value of not doing things sometimes, because you'll rush into a decision that just has terrible consequences. And a lot of my job at the moment is looking forward to what the impact of decisions or actions taken by the company could be further down the line. So I would say it's made me a lot more, I was about to say patient. It hasn't really made me any more patient because I like to get things done quickly. But it made me a lot more considered. So I like to make decisions quickly, but I also like to look at them from every possible angle to make sure I'm not missing out on any opportunities. Just on the business side, and that's from both playing the games and working on the games. Like games are not quick to make at all, and they're not easy to make at all. And Stronghold games, and RTS games in general, really, they are probably one of the more complex games for a small studio to do, because with Stronghold, you've got obviously the sim strategy stuff, but any game that has RTS, pathfinding in it, loads of units, that just takes such a long time to make. When I came in, I was like, okay, cool, we're going to start a game, it's going to be done in a year or so, then we're going to release the next one. And you can't look at it that way, because a game can just get delayed out of nowhere at the last minute for an extremely good business, dev, or production reason. And that's the kind of thing I've learned to just kind of be at peace with that. So when it comes to like making decisions that affect us further down the line, I'll think, okay, cool, but am I making a decision here that isn't flexible later on? And that's what we have to do in the games. So I've learned from both the games and working on them that you need to look as far down the line as possible before making any real big decisions, but still make those decisions quickly, because that's no excuse to slow down. I appreciate that Firefly is a company that doesn't just make stupid decisions that could result in a project being canned or a terrible, destruction of one of our revenue streams or something like that. Firefly is quite a considered company. So in the world we live in which people in games can just come into work and find out that they just don't have a job because it was decided by their publisher or one of their shareholders that their studio wasn't making the right kind of game for that moment or whatever. I think it's pretty easy to underestimate the value in like just being in a secure job that you like with people that you get on with. I think that's kind of, in an industry that you love, the trust that the company has in you, it's kind of by necessity because someone's brought in to fulfill a role that has so many different aspects and permutations and so much potential there. So there's quite a big hole that you're traditionally filling at a small company like Firefly. The hiring process means that by the time you're actually on board, they trust you sufficiently that you can take whatever you're doing in pretty much any direction you want. You'll obviously want guidance from the people managing you and the bosses of the company and the people who know the products really well. But I feel like, yeah, there's a lot of trust there, and I don't think you get that at a lot of companies. If you're the right kind of person for it, if you can kind of get up off your ass and just do things without having to be told to do them, then it really works for you. In my mind, whenever I think back to working on Crusader 2 in the sort of towards the end of the project, it did involve a lot of quite hard work, but I do remember the very quick glass of champagne we had when we made it live on Steam. And we started to get the first reviews in of people saying they really enjoyed playing the game. And we had like a tiny little glass of champagne, and then we went straight back to work. But that was that felt like something that, you know, it came at the end of probably a good 6 to 12 months of really, really hard, you know, hard work. And it felt like all the differences we'd had over that period of time and all the kind of stress caused, it felt like it was all worth it. And we felt like we'd created something that is extremely hard to do. And, you know, it sort of satisfied our audience as well, which was something that, you know, I find obviously as a marketing person quite important. But yeah, that felt like a pretty significant payoff. Like there's this expression which is, if you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life. The reality of that is if you love your job, you'll never be able to disconnect yourself from your job. So even if it's coming towards the end of a project like Crusader 2, or in the future Stronghold Next, I assume, and everyone's working really, really hard, and you can see people are working overtime and all this kind of stuff, even if you've got nothing to contribute at that particular day or week or whatever, and even if your boss is not saying to you, you know, stay behind or work on the weekends or whatever, you'll go ahead and do that anyway. But I've found it quite hard over the years to kind of separate myself from my work, and I still find myself thinking about it all the time, which is great because it means that sometimes you'll come out of the shower and you'll suddenly have a solution to a problem that's been bugging you for weeks, right? And that's obviously going to help de-stress you. But it also means that while you were taking a shower, you were thinking about something that is unrelated to trying to relax or just, you know, decompress and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I wouldn't say I have a particularly bad memory specifically associated with Firefly. I would say that working in games so far has taught me that you will, by necessity, be unable to separate yourself from your job in a lot of sort of scenarios. And that can be great, but also not so great. I think I prefer this to working in an industry that I'm not passionate about and, you know, would be able to just go home at the end of the day and just completely disconnect, because it means that during that day, I wouldn't really be engaged with what I'm doing and I wouldn't sort of care about what I'm doing in the way that I do now. But it definitely has its drawbacks, and yes, prioritize mental health for sure. I'd like to say that in 10 years, Stronghold will, I think even just still being here would be a massive accomplishment for any franchise. Like Stronghold's been around since 2001, so like 18-ish years at this point. There aren't many franchises that have stuck around for that long. A lot of franchises simply become irrelevant as time moves on. People's tastes change, the industry changes, technology changes, and people's kind of, you know, appetite for something just disappears, basically. I think that if in 10 years we can still make strategy simulation something that's really interesting to people, I think the medieval side of things will just be completely timeless. I don't think that the appeal of that is going to dull at all. But I think that in terms of the kind of gameplay systems and the complexity there and all the refinements we can possibly make with that, I think that if we can still make that compelling in 10 years, whether it's through the introduction of new mechanics or new graphics or, you know, anything that we can do to make Stronghold more compelling as a brand for people, I think just existing in 10 years will be a huge achievement. But if I were to kind of look towards the future of Stronghold, I would definitely keep one foot in the past. One advantage of working on Stronghold for such a long time is it's taught me that the things people love about Stronghold as a brand and as a series aren't simply, oh, I remember this thing from the first game. They're not like, I need it to be 2D. I need to have this specific voice actor in the game. It kind of drills down to more sort of fundamental things about the brand that are important to people. People love the accents because it's weird humor. You don't expect to like click on a unit in an RTS and get like a Geordie accent or a Brummie accent. So, you know, you have to drill down to what people kind of love about that and why they love that. The scribe is popular for a whole bunch of reasons. Like, it doesn't need to be the scribe, but they love that character. They love his like cheeky grin and all that kind of stuff. And like, again, with the 2D stuff, people love that because they love the precision of the gameplay. So even in 10 years, whether the game's 2D or 3D or whatever, you have to kind of drill back to why they love that thing. I think keeping one foot in the past is important in sort of going, okay, cool, we've got this new engine, but how do we make it do the thing that people love and, you know, that kind of reminds them of their sort of earlier titles and reminds them of why they fell in love with the Stronghold series in the first place. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say like keeping one foot in the past and bringing with us what we can, but also making it, you have to change, because if you don't change, in 5 years, Stronghold could be completely irrelevant. So I came into the company at a time when, yeah, they're quite small, especially in relative terms to how big they'd grown. Like towards the end of the 3D Strongholds and development on Dungeon Hero, the team size, I think, was sufficient that they needed like 2 floors in this building, which, you know, seems crazy to me because I came out at a time when there were literally just a handful of people in the studio upstairs, and they obviously saw having a marketing person as pretty important to their future plans, because if they've only got like 10, 15 people, bringing one person in is quite a big deal, especially like a developer. Like, you're either going to go for first port of call is probably going to be a programmer, because you know, they're just seen as kind of the biggest contributors a lot of the time. Then probably someone like an artist or a designer, and then you've got kind of producers and people that can manage situations. And in my mind, a marketing person was quite a sort of would have been quite a low priority at that time, especially considering they were still working with a publisher for their sort of main titles. But obviously they saw that as quite a big deal. So I was coming out of university around 2010. So actually at the time I was getting a paper published based on my dissertation that was about free-to-play and about how that would change games and about how it was just sort of second nature to people in Asia at the time. Free-to-play has been, you know, a big thing there for ages. And you know, there was a lot of skepticism at the time around whether it would work in Western markets, because people were just so used to the traditional way you'd buy a game in a box, put it in your disc tray, and just sort of start playing it. So I was always already very aware of, and I'm not sure whether I mentioned this in my interview or not, it might be what got me the job, but I was already very aware of that was kind of a wave of the future that was coming and that was inevitable. So when I joined the company and they put Kingdoms in front of me and said, this is your priority. Right now, this is your priority. You know, we make traditional, box Stronghold games, and that's fine. We'll keep doing that. But this is the scary new world of, you know, free-to-play online, always-on games that, we need to understand as a company as soon as possible. You have to kind of deal with the situation where you're still trying to make players aware that we still make traditional Stronghold games. Mm-hmm. And that audience, these days, people are a lot more understanding of free-to-play. Like, if a game comes out and it's free-to-play, it can be the biggest game of any title currently in the market, right? Like Apex, you know, is the most relevant example at the moment. But back then you really had to kind of work to convince people that, you know, this wasn't you just selling out. And I think there's still a little bit of taboo around it in that regard, but it's nothing like it was back then. So it was an interesting experience starting out and telling people that, hey, we're taking the Stronghold brand in this sort of very, very different direction. And I think the Stronghold community kind of helped us build the basis for what formed our Kingdoms community. But once the Kingdoms community had really taken form, it was something completely different. Mm-hmm. And I had to also get my head around the production involved in making an online game and the idea that the updates essentially kind of never end. Mm-hmm. So like with a traditional box Stronghold game, you can look at it sort of these days and go, okay, cool. So a typical PR cycle might be 9 to 12 months for a sort of medium-sized game that isn't Metal Gear Solid or Super Smash Brothers or one of these like huge brands. and you go, cool, so I'm going to announce here, I'm going to plan out all my PR beats, and then it's probably going to come out around this time. It won't come out around the time that you think it's going to come out, but eventually will, because game dev. So kind of adjusting that for a game that can last for 10 years was the kind of biggest change from my point of view. And a lot of my training was in traditional launch marketing. So you'd build up to release, you'd have a launch, and then that would be it. Yeah. You might resell the product through add-ons or DLC or re-releases, that kind of stuff. But once you've launched, yeah. And that's kind of your sort of Hail Mary shot once you've got all your sort of ducks lined up. So shifting from that to it just being like, okay, cool, this is online game, and the marketing is as much about making sure people know about why the game's interesting and what the updates are, as much about that as it is about working on the actual game itself. And I think that with free-to-play and service-based games, people working in marketing have to get involved in the actual development of the game, because the things they can affect aren't just telling people about the product that exists, but also saying, this is the reason why people aren't sticking around. This is the reason why players are leaving this game world. This is the reason why this update is unpopular. So you're coming more into sort of project management and product management skills. And I think as a marketer, there's a little bit of a taboo around being a marketer in games, because you're not seen as a developer. Mm-hmm. So when you kind of try and come in and say, this part of the game isn't working for these reasons, and here's the research and here's the players that make this thing obvious. It's very difficult to get buy-in from the rest of the team, because you are there's a dividing line between you and the rest of the developers, quite rightly. But when you've got when you're coming in, with data and with information from users, you kind of need to be taken seriously. Otherwise, these kind of service-based games can't survive, essentially. I think in terms of the challenges from my point of view, you get to the point with an MMO where everyone that's currently playing the game kind of understands why something is interesting, right? So they play it every day, so they understand why a tiny little nerf here or a buff there could completely change the metagame, could completely change, the sort of their daily interactions with the game. But making people outside of the game understand that, I think is quite challenging. And unless you have something like a World of Warcraft style expansion or a sort of a very narrative-driven MMO experience, it's very difficult to communicate to players outside of the MMO why that's interesting. I think with traditional boxed games, you can kind of communicate that a new update adds a feature, or some DLC adds a bunch of maps and characters and all this kind of stuff. But when it comes to MMOs, the most important thing for people can be a simple change to a rule set. That can make or break a game for some people. And I think it was difficult for me shifting between my sort of, not loudmouth, but my kind of my loud sort of fanfare marketing that works really well for box products, to the marketing required for a service-based free-to-play game, which is a lot more we know the absolute details of what we're changing here. Here's what we're changing. Here's why it's important, and just making sure we're sort of as connected with the player base as possible. Whereas in a traditional game, you could just sort of announce that you're adding X feature or Y levels or Z character, and anyone, regardless of whether they'd known the brand before or played the game before, they kind of understand why that's cool. And it was kind of me personally sort of getting to grips with the fact that we could just change a few values, and that could be more important for people playing the game than a huge new feature that they might try for 5 minutes and then go, it's all right, but I'm just going to keep playing the game the way that I want to play it. The problem with doing a service-based game is that your customer support side of things has to interact with so many people, hundreds of people every single day with various issues, genuine or otherwise. You're dealing with people who have a game-breaking bug that absolutely needs to get fixed. You're dealing with people that are making sort of fraudulent PayPal transactions and all the kind of stuff that breaks our terms of use. Yeah. But then you occasionally get something very serious come through. So, like any MMO, we've had people who, absolutely lovely stories. We find out that they actually met on Kingdoms. They got married, and the idea that people exist in this world, a child literally exists in this world because of the game that you made, is weird. Yeah. So we've got loads of awesome stories like that, but then occasionally it'll come through and, we have to take it seriously every single time that someone's passed away. And a lot of the time, well, all the time, we'll take it absolutely seriously. We'll verify it. We'll do what we can. There's certain things we can't do because of the terms of use. But there was one time when, and it's worth noting that when people, if people have died in the game or someone's become ill or something like that, there'll be all this amazing stuff in game. Like people will send attacks in the shapes of hearts and all this kind of lovely stuff, like design their coat of arms dedicated to a specific person, all this really, really human stuff that comes out of it. But occasionally people will fake their own in-game deaths for various account related reasons. We'll never forget the time that a player basically did this as an attempt to start a new life in the game, I believe was the reason. The Politics and Kingdoms are as much the metagame as any sort of territorial, glory-based, stat tracking. The politics is kind of why people stay around. The house marshal system and the house officer system is a huge part of why people play the game. And this person had obviously decided that they wanted a clean slate. Like in movies where a character is told that they can just wipe their slate clean for a huge amount of money or a big sacrifice or something like that. This is basically an in-game version of that. And luckily, we worked out that this person had faked their own death and we were able to kind of remedy it. But just the idea that people would go to those lengths to wipe their digital life clean and start fresh, whether they mean to infiltrate a house as a result or I don't know what they were actually trying to do. But just purely the idea that someone would go to those lengths to sort of, to change their virtual life, start a fresh virtual life in the world that we created is both extremely flattering and terrifying at the same time. I think if I had one hope for Stronghold Next, it's just to bring together the two sides of our audience that, want something brand new from a new Stronghold game, and the other side that want all the sort of classic features and aspects and gameplay that they love from the original titles together. And hopefully this will come across in the reel and all the kind of videos that we do after that point. But I think it is possible to have your cake and eat it too with regards to Stronghold. Like you can have those classic features in the game, but you can change things up at the same time. I think it's important to sort of measure any changes based on the past. So if you're going to add something new to the game, make sure it's a extension of something that came before, like something that we know that players love. Like refine that, expand upon that, and change that in a way that's interesting for gameplay and new for players. Because people have been playing Stronghold and Crusader for like nearly 20 years now, and they continue to do so. Like Crusader is still probably our most popular game on Steam, and I think it is possible to bring those two sort of worlds together. So if I had one dream for Stronghold Next, it would be that it has a lot of the things that you love from classic Stronghold, but it more importantly changes it in a way that you find exciting because it builds on something that, no pun intended, builds on something that you remember loving and you still love, and change it in an unexpected way that you didn't necessarily think we would go for, but you can kind of see the logic of it as fans of the genre.